Who is this man? The mafia boss burned with jealousy when he saw his secretary on a date. The Sapphire Lounge was quiet enough for dangerous men, but loud enough that no one should notice Zito Monaldo walking in. Still, the moment he crossed the entrance, the air seemed to shift. 2 security guards in black suits stayed near the glass doors while Zito walked forward with steady steps, powerful shoulders, and eyes that scanned the room like a predator always hunting. He was not there for romance. A shipping magnate demanded a meeting before midnight. Zito hated last-minute changes, but he agreed. What he did not expect was to have every breath stolen from his lungs in seconds. By the time he reached the host's stand, he had already texted his second-in-command. "Cancel the meeting. Handle the magnate. I am not coming." He silenced his phone, ignoring the consequences. 10 steps inside, he froze. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. His jaw locked. His hand tightened around the whiskey glass he hadn't realized he was holding. Melissa Becker. She was there, at a small table near the floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the river, and she was not alone. Zito's eyes darkened without him realizing. Melissa laughed softly at something. A real laugh, not controlled, not careful. A real warm laugh he had never heard from her inside his office. She leaned forward slightly, tucking loose chestnut waves behind her ear. The man across from her smiled and reached for her hand over the table. Zito almost stopped breathing. Who is this man? The question hit him with a force he was not prepared for. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. His executive assistant, his Melissa, was on a date. A real date with a real man in a place Zito owned for private meetings. A waiter approached with a polished smile. "Good evening, Mr. Monaldo. Table for one?" Zito didn't answer. His stare was locked on the scene by the window. Melissa smiling like that. Melissa dressed like that. Melissa leaning closer to a stranger. The waiter followed Zito's gaze, then whispered carefully, "Ah, yes. The lady arrived about 40 minutes ago with, 'Don't finish that sentence.'" Zito's voice was low but razor sharp. The waiter straightened immediately. "Of course, sir. Would you like a table?" Zito nodded slowly, as if pulling his eyes away from Melissa required physical effort, something with a clear view. He didn't know why he said it. He didn't even pretend otherwise. The waiter led him to a table exactly 2 spots away from Melissa's. Zito sat but didn't touch the menu. He did not care about food. He cared about the way the man across from Melissa leaned his elbows on the table like he already owned the right to be there. The man laughed again. Warm. Too warm. Zito felt a muscle twitch beneath his eye. "Boss, Santino," one of his men, said as he approached from the back entrance. "You're early. Our contact is stuck in traffic." Zito's eyes never left Melissa. "Sit, and tell me what you see." Santino followed his gaze, then made a small sound of understanding. "That's your assistant. She's here with someone." Zito's tone was flat, but a wildfire was spreading underneath. "I can see that." Santino shifted uncomfortably. "Looks like a date, boss." Zito didn't respond. His jaw tightened harder. He watched Melissa in complete silence. She looked different tonight. Softer, lighter, stunning in a way he tried to ignore every single day at work. Her hair was loose, falling naturally over her bare shoulders. Her dress was red silk, simple but devastating. She almost glowed under the soft amber lights, and she didn't look tense or guarded like she always did when dealing with him. She looked peaceful. The man reached out and touched her wrist gently. Zito leaned forward without noticing. His fingers curled around the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. 3 years. That's how long Melissa Becker had been organizing his chaotic, violent world with military precision. 3 years of early mornings and late nights, of rescheduled meetings and canceled weekends, of standing between him and chaos with nothing but a tablet and a voice that never wavered even when his temper exploded. She was efficient, brilliant, unshakable. She knew his coffee order before he walked into the office. She knew which calls to screen and which enemies to let through. She knew when to speak and when silence was safer. She became the one constant in a life built on shifting loyalties and blood-signed contracts. But 10 days ago, everything changed. Melissa walked into his office at exactly 9 in the morning, placed a single sheet of paper on his desk, and said 4 words that shattered his illusion of control. "This is my resignation." Zito didn't look up from the contract he was reading. He assumed it was a negotiation tactic, a play for more money or better hours. "Denied," he said, his voice cold and final. "I don't accept it." Melissa didn't argue. She just nodded, turned on her heel, and walked out. He thought that was the end of it. He was wrong. She kept working. She kept showing up. But something fundamental had shifted. The warmth in her voice when she answered his calls disappeared. The way she used to linger in his office doorway with updates, waiting to see if he needed anything else, stopped completely. She became a ghost in a black blazer, efficient and distant, counting down the days until her 2-week notice expired. Zito told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he could replace her. He told himself assistants were interchangeable, that loyalty was purchased, that no one was irreplaceable in his world. He was lying to himself. And tonight, watching her laugh with a man who looked nothing like him, a man in a cheap blue suit with soft hands and kind eyes, Zito realized the devastating truth. He had wasted 3 years treating her like furniture. He had wasted 3 years assuming she would always be there, standing in the shadows of his empire, waiting for him to notice her as anything more than the woman who scheduled his destruction. He thought he had time. He thought wrong. When the man stood from the table, probably to take a call or use the restroom, Zito's entire body reacted before his brain could stop him. He stood. The movement was sharp, decisive, final. Santino's voice was a distant warning. "Boss, don't." But Zito was already walking toward her. Each step felt like crossing a battlefield. The soft jazz that had been background noise moments ago now sounded like a funeral march. The distance between his table and hers stretched impossibly long, yet he crossed it in seconds. Melissa didn't notice him at first. She was looking down at her phone, a soft smile still playing at the corners of her mouth. That smile, the one reserved for strangers and men who deserved it, cut deeper than any knife he'd ever taken. He stopped at the edge of her table. His shadow fell across the white tablecloth. She looked up. The smile died instantly. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, neither of them spoke. Her eyes widened, not with fear but with something worse. Resignation, like she'd been expecting this, like she knew he couldn't let her have even one night of peace. The red silk of her dress caught the light as she straightened in her chair. Up close, he could see the small pearl earrings trembling slightly. He could smell the white tea and amber scent that haunted his office long after she left each night. He could see the way her shoulders tensed, the way the mask slipped back into place, transforming her from the laughing woman into the guarded assistant. "Mr. Monaldo." Her voice was professional, detached, cold. It was the voice she used in board meetings when his enemies were listening. "Is there something you need?" The question was a blade. She didn't ask what he was doing there. She didn't ask why he was interrupting. She simply reverted to her role, the role he had forced her into for 3 years. Secretary, assistant, employee, never Melissa, never the woman, just the function. Zito opened his mouth to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. What could he say? That seeing her here broke something inside him he didn't know existed? That watching another man touch her wrist made him want to flip the table and drag her out like a caveman? That he finally understood what he was losing. But only now, when it was 4 days too late? Before he could force any words out, movement caught his eye. The man in the blue suit was returning to the table, and in his hand, clearly visible even from a distance, was a small velvet box. The kind of box that held rings. The kind of box that asked questions Zito had never thought to ask. The man's face was nervous, hopeful, determined. He was walking back to propose. To Melissa. To his Melissa. Zito's vision tunneled. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to act, to do something. But he stood frozen, watching his entire world collapse in the warm glow of the Sapphire Lounge, while soft jazz played and Melissa Becker looked at him with eyes that held no hope at all. The velvet box seemed to pulse in Charlie's hand like a second heartbeat. Zito's feet moved before his brain gave permission. 3 strides. That's all it took to close the distance. He didn't sit. He didn't ask. He simply stood at the edge of their table, a wall of dark fabric and controlled violence, casting a shadow that swallowed the candlelight whole. Charlie stopped mid-step, the box disappearing into his jacket pocket with fumbling fingers. His face went pale, then red, then pale again. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Monaldo, I didn't realize you were—" "Sit." Zito's voice was quiet, but it cut through the soft jazz like a blade through silk. Charlie sat. Fast. His chair scraped against the floor with an ugly sound that made nearby diners glance over. Zito pulled out the empty chair at their small table and lowered himself into it without invitation. His movements slow and deliberate, like a king claiming territory that had always been his. Melissa's jaw tightened. Her fingers, which had been resting softly on the table, curled into a fist. Mr. Monaldo. The formality was a weapon. This is my personal time. You have no right. Who is he? Zito interrupted, his eyes never leaving Charlie's face. Up close, the man looked even more ordinary. Clean-shaven, soft hands, a watch that told time but didn't scream wealth, a tie that was probably bought at a department store. Everything about him was beige, safe, forgettable. Everything Zito was not. Charlie's Adam's apple bobbed. Charlie Morrison. I'm a history teacher at... I didn't ask for your resume. Zito's tone was flat, but underneath molten rage simmered just beneath the surface. I asked who you are. To her. He tilted his head toward Melissa without looking at her. If he looked at her now, if he saw that red silk, and those loose waves, and that mouth that never smiled at him the way it smiled at this stranger, he would lose the fragile control he was clinging to. Charlie's hands began to tremble as he reached for his water glass, his fear palpable. He glanced at Melissa, a silent plea for help. She didn't give it. She just sat there, spine straight, chin lifted, the picture of composure except for the slight tremor in her hands. That's none of your business, she said, her voice low and steady. You don't get to walk into my life outside of work and demand answers. You don't get to... Answer the question, Melissa. Zito finally looked at her. The impact nearly knocked the air from his lungs. This close, he could see the small freckle just below her left ear that her hair usually covered. He could see the faint pulse jumping at the base of her throat. He could see the way her pupils dilated slightly when his gaze locked onto hers. A physical reaction she couldn't control even as her face remained carved from ice. She held his stare for 3 long seconds, then looked away. He's someone I'm getting to know, she said carefully. Someone I met through a friend. Someone who has nothing to do with contracts or territories or blood oaths. Someone normal. The word normal landed like a fist to his gut. Zito's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. And what am I? Melissa's laugh was sharp and bitter. You're my boss. That's all you've ever been. That's all you ever wanted to be. She reached for her wine glass, took a small sip, and set it down with precise control. Now, if you'll excuse us, Charlie and I were in the middle of an interview. Zito's eyes narrowed. He'd spent a lifetime reading people, measuring their tells, finding the cracks in their armor, and Melissa, his Melissa, was holding something back. That's what this is, isn't it? You're not in love with him. He looked at Charlie, who had gone very still, his face a mixture of confusion and growing dread. She doesn't look at you the way a woman looks at a man she loves. She looks at you the way someone looks at a safety net. Functional, necessary, boring. Zito. Melissa's voice was a warning now, low and dangerous. But he couldn't stop. The words were bleeding out of him. 3 years of silence finally rupturing. Tell me I'm wrong. He leaned forward, closing the space between them until he could smell that damned white tea scent that haunted him. Tell me you love him. Tell me you wake up thinking about him. Tell me he makes your pulse race and your breath catch and your... Stop. Melissa stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. The red silk whispered against her skin as she rose. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly now, the composure cracking at the edges. You want the truth? Fine. I'm making a choice, Zito. Is that what you want to hear? Zito stood as well, towering over the small table. A choice for what? For a father. The words dropped into the space between them like stones into still water. I'm 26 years old. I've spent 3 years of my life organizing your chaos, managing your destruction, watching you build an empire while I stood in the shadows holding your schedule. I want a family. Zito, I want Sundays off. I want a man who comes home at 5 in the evening, who doesn't have enemies waiting in dark parking lots, who doesn't make me lie awake at night wondering if he's going to come back in a body bag. Zito felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Charlie, really looked at him, the nervous smile, the kind eyes, the safe, boring, predictable life written all over him. Then he looked back at Melissa and saw what he'd been too blind to see before. She wasn't happy, even with safety standing right in front of her, offering her everything she claimed to want. She looked tired, resigned, like a woman who'd given up on fairy tales and settled for instruction manuals. You don't love him, Zito said quietly. It wasn't a question. Melissa's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. Love is a luxury I can't afford anymore, Mr. Monaldo. I learned that from you. She grabbed her purse from the back of her chair, her movements sharp and efficient. My resignation stands. You have 4 days left to find my replacement. I suggest you start looking. She turned to Charlie, who was still sitting frozen, his face pale. I'm sorry. Can we reschedule? I need some air. Charlie nodded mutely, relief and disappointment warring on his features. Melissa walked away from the table without looking back, her heels clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Zito watched her go. Watched the red silk disappear into the crowd. Watched the one thing he'd never known he needed walk straight out of his life. He stood there in the middle of the Sapphire Lounge, surrounded by clinking glasses and soft laughter, and the jazz that wouldn't stop playing, feeling like a king who'd just discovered his kingdom was built on sand. Charlie cleared his throat. Mr. Monaldo, I don't want any trouble. I'm just... Go home! Zito's voice was hollow. She's not yours. But she's not mine either. He turned and walked away, leaving Charlie sitting alone at a table set for 2, a velvet box burning a hole in his pocket, and absolutely no idea what had just happened. Zito didn't sleep. He sat in his penthouse office watching the city lights blink out one by one as dawn crept over Manhattan like a thief. The space around him felt cavernous, empty in a way that had nothing to do with square footage. 40 floors up, glass walls on 3 sides, leather and mahogany and original artwork that meant nothing. He'd built this tower to prove he'd made it, to prove he was untouchable. But sitting there in the gray light of morning, all he felt was the echo of his own breathing. Her scent was still there. White tea and amber, faint but unmistakable, clinging to the air near her desk like a ghost. He'd walked past it 3 times in the night, each time stopping, each time pressing his palm flat against the polished wood surface where her hands had rested for 3 years. The desk was organized, as always, pens lined up, files color-coded, her computer logged out and locked. Everything perfect, everything controlled, everything Melissa. The sun rose, the city woke. Zito stayed motionless in his chair, staring at her empty desk, a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched going warm in his hand. His phone buzzed 12 times, contracts waiting, deals collapsing, territory disputes that required his immediate attention. He ignored all of it. For the first time in 15 years, Zito Monaldo didn't care about the empire. He only cared about the woman who'd kept it running while he played king. The elevator chimed at 8:45. 15 minutes early, like always. His heart lurched. Melissa stepped into the office carrying a cardboard box and nothing else. No briefcase. No tablet. No armor. She wore black slacks and a simple white blouse, her hair pulled back in that severe bun he'd seen 1,000 times. But now, after seeing her in red silk, with waves falling over her shoulders, the bun looked like a prison, like she was locking herself away again, hiding the real Melissa behind the efficient assistant who never asked for anything. She didn't look at him. She walked straight to her desk, set the box down, and began removing her personal items. A framed photo of her mother, a small succulent plant she'd nursed for 2 years, the coffee mug with a chip in the rim that she refused to throw away. Each item went into the box with careful precision, her movements economical, practiced, final. Zito stood. His legs felt unsteady, like he'd forgotten how to walk. Melissa. His voice came out rougher than intended. She paused, her hand hovering over a stack of sticky notes, but she didn't turn around. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Monaldo. The formality was a knife between his ribs. My resignation was submitted 10 days ago. I'm simply collecting my belongings. I can give you Sundays. The lie tasted like ash, but he said it anyway. I can restructure, hire more staff. You wouldn't have to work weekends anymore. You can't give me safety. Zito. She finally turned, and the look on her face broke something inside him. It wasn't anger, it was pity. You are the storm. You don't get to offer me an umbrella and pretend that changes what you are. She picked up the succulent, cradling it gently. I knew what I was signing up for 3 years ago. I'm not angry. I'm just done pretending I can survive in your world without losing myself completely. Zito crossed the room before he could stop himself. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to smell that scent that was driving him insane. Name your price. A new title. VP of Operations. Partner. I'll put you on the board. I'm not negotiating. Melissa's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she placed the plant in the box. I'm not a contract you can amend, Zito. I'm not a deal you can sweeten. I am not an asset you can liquidate when the terms no longer suit you. She reached for the photo frame, and their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, brief, devastating. She pulled back as if burned. Behind them, the television mounted on the wall flickered to life. Santino must have activated it remotely, part of the morning routine. Financial news, market updates, industry reports. Zito ignored it, his entire focus locked on the woman in front of him, who was systematically erasing herself from his life one personal item at a time. The news anchor's voice cut through the tension like a serrated blade. Breaking news this morning in the world of organized crime families. Sources confirm that Zito Monaldo, head of the Monaldo Syndicate, is set to marry Isabella Russo on June 1st. The arrangement, a dormant contract signed by his late father, was officially activated by the council this morning. Insiders are calling it a historic peace treaty that will reportedly... Melissa went perfectly still. The photo frame slipped from her fingers, hitting the desk with a dull thud. She didn't pick it up. She just stared at the television screen where his photo appeared next to a beautiful dark-haired woman in diamonds and designer labels. Isabella Russo, the ghost he'd been trying to bury. The contract signed in his father's blood that he'd planned to annul. The secret he'd kept because he thought he had time. Melissa, Zito's voice cracked. He reached for her arm, but she stepped back, the movement sharp and final. Don't. The single word held 3 years of suppressed pain. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and what he saw in her eyes was worse than anger. It was understanding, bitter, resigned understanding. She assumes his recent silence and distance were because he was finalizing this date. The timeline fits perfectly in her mind. No. Zito's hands curled into fists at his sides. That contract is a relic. A business arrangement I never agreed to. I was going to annul it. I was... When? Melissa's voice rose for the first time, sharp and raw. When were you going to annul it, Zito? Before or after I spent 3 more years organizing your wedding to someone else? She grabbed the cardboard box, hugging it to her chest like a shield. You know what the saddest part is? I actually believed last night meant something. I believed you cared. I was wrong. She walked to her desk one last time and pulled her security badge from her pocket. She placed it on the polished wood with a quiet click that sounded like a door closing. I hope she makes you happy, Zito. I hope she gives you everything I couldn't. She headed toward the elevator. Melissa, wait. But the elevator doors were already closing, swallowing her and that cardboard box and the last 3 years of his life. The television droned on, the anchor discussing merger implications and territorial agreements, and the strategic genius of binding 2 families through marriage. Strategic genius. They called it strategic genius. Zito picked up the whiskey glass from his desk. For one long moment, he just held it, feeling the weight, feeling the emptiness of the room pressing in. Then he hurled it at the television screen. Glass exploded. Amber liquid ran down the wall like blood. The screen went dark, but the damage was done. She was gone. And this time, she wasn't coming back. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking for the first time in a decade, and dialed a number he'd been avoiding for months. An old man answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gravelly and suspicious. Zito. To what do we owe the pleasure? Cancel the meeting, Zito said, his voice hollow. I'm coming to the council. We need to talk about the Russo arrangement. He hung up before the old man could respond. Then he stood in his empty penthouse office, surrounded by broken glass and the ghost of white tea and amber, and realized he'd just declared war on his own legacy, for a woman who might never forgive him, for a woman who was worth more than every territory he'd ever claimed. The council met in a place that smelled like old money and older blood. A brownstone in Brooklyn that had stood for 100 years, its windows blackened from the inside, its door unmarked. Zito climbed the stone steps at exactly noon, no security detail flanking him, no army at his back. Just him and the weight of a decision that would either save him or destroy him. The door opened before he could knock. A man with silver hair and dead eyes gestured him inside without a word. The boardroom was exactly as he remembered. Long mahogany tables scarred with decades of deals and betrayals. High-backed chairs that looked like thrones. No windows. No natural light. Just the sickly yellow glow of overhead fixtures that made everyone look like corpses. 7 men sat around the table, their faces carved from stone and cruelty. The elders. The ones who'd built the empire before Zito was born. The ones who thought they still owned it. Don Salvatore sat at the head of the table, his liver-spotted hands folded over a cane he didn't need. Zito, we expected you yesterday. The Russo girl's father is getting impatient. His voice was gravel and smoke, courtesy of 50 years of Cuban cigars. We need to finalize the ceremony details. June or September. Zito didn't sit. He stood at the foot of the table, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes moving from face to face. These men had taught him everything. How to read a contract. How to break a man without touching him. How to build loyalty through fear. They'd made him into the king he'd become. And now he was going to burn it all down. I'm not marrying Isabella Russo. The words dropped into the silence like grenades. No one moved. No one breathed. The overhead lights hummed. Don Salvatore's expression didn't change. Excuse me? The arrangement my father made. I'm annulling it. Zito's voice was steady, calm, final. Find another way to broker peace with the Russos. I'm not the price you get to pay. Don Carmine, seated to Salvatore's right, let out a bark of laughter that held no humor. You think you have a choice? Your father signed that contract in blood, boy. Blood oath. You know what that means. You honor it or you disgrace his memory. My father's been dead for 3 years. Zito met his eyes without flinching. His contracts died with him. I'm annulling the arrangement. I'm here as a courtesy to tell you in person. Courtesy. Don Salvatore tasted the word like poison. He leaned forward, the cane creaking under his weight. Let me explain courtesy to you, Zito. Courtesy is you marrying the Russo girl and keeping the peace. Courtesy is you doing your duty. What you're doing right now? That's treason. He tapped the cane once against the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. You walk away from this marriage. You walk away from everything. The seat, the territory, the accounts, the title. You leave with nothing but what is in your private personal accounts. The family assets are gone. That's the price of dishonor. The other elders murmured agreement, a chorus of ancient men clinging to ancient rules. Zito felt something crack open inside his chest. Not fear, not regret, relief, pure, crystalline relief. He'd been carrying the weight of this empire since he was 23 years old. 10 years of blood and strategy and sleepless nights. 10 years of building something he'd never wanted but couldn't refuse. And now, standing in this airless room surrounded by men who saw him as property, he realized he didn't want it anymore. He wanted red silk and loose chestnut waves. He wanted white tea and amber. He wanted a woman who looked at him like he was human, not a weapon. He wanted Melissa. Zito smiled. It was a terrible smile, cold and sharp and utterly without fear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the signet ring. Heavy gold, engraved with the Monaldo crest, passed down through 5 generations. The symbol of his power, the physical manifestation of everything he was supposed to be. He held it up so they could all see it, the gold catching the sickly light. Keep the money, Zito said quietly. Keep the ships, keep the territory, keep the title. He tossed the ring onto the mahogany table. It landed with a sharp, metallic sound, then spun. A blur of gold rotating faster and faster, before finally settling with the crest facing up. The room was so silent he could hear his own heartbeat. I'm done playing king in your game. Don Salvatore's face turned purple. You insolent, do you have any idea what you've just done? You've insulted this council. You've insulted the Russos. You've insulted every tradition I know exactly what I've done. Zito's voice cut through the old man's rage like a blade through silk. I've chosen myself over your empire. I've chosen a life over a legacy. And I've chosen a woman who sees me as a man, not a title. He turned toward the door. Consider this my resignation. Effective immediately. He walked out. Behind him, chaos erupted, voices shouting, the cane slamming against the floor, threats thrown like stones. He didn't look back. He pushed through the unmarked door and stepped onto the Brooklyn street, and the world shifted beneath his feet. His phone buzzed once, twice, 12 times in rapid succession. Notifications, account access denied, credit cards frozen, security detail reassigned. They were fast. He had to give them that. Within 2 minutes of walking out of that boardroom, Zito Monaldo ceased to exist in the way he'd existed for a decade. No power, no protection, no empire. Just a man in an expensive suit standing on a sidewalk in Brooklyn with absolutely nothing to his name except a private account they couldn't touch and a heart that wouldn't stop racing. The sky opened up. Rain fell in cold sheets, soaking through his shirt, plastering his hair to his forehead. He should have felt devastated. He should have felt the weight of what he'd just lost crushing him. Instead, he felt light, untethered, free. Zito stepped off the curb and raised his hand. A yellow taxi, battered and ordinary, pulled to the side. He hadn't hailed a cab since he was 17. He opened the door, slid into the worn back seat, and gave the driver an address he'd memorized but never visited. Melissa's apartment. The driver pulled into traffic. The rain hammered against the roof, and Zito Monaldo, former king of a crumbling empire, sat in the back of a taxi with water dripping from his hair and realized he had no idea if she'd even open the door. Melissa's apartment building was nothing like his penthouse. 5 stories of red brick, fire escapes zigzagging down the facade, a front door that didn't lock properly, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, and the landlord took 3 weeks to fix a leaky faucet. Zito stood on the sidewalk staring up at the 3rd-floor window where a dim light glowed behind curtains, and for the first time in his life, he felt small. The rain had turned his $1,000 suit into a sodden mess. His hair hung in his eyes, water dripped from his sleeves, pooled in his shoes. He looked like a beggar king, stripped of his crown, standing outside the castle walls hoping for mercy. He climbed the concrete steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. The building smelled like old cooking oil and laundry detergent. Normal smells, human smells. Smells that had nothing to do with leather boardrooms and Cuban cigars. He found her door. 3rd floor, apartment 3C. A small wreath hung on the outside, dried red and baby's breath. Of course it was red. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What was he doing? What did he expect? That she'd see him soaked and broken and fall into his arms? That grand gestures could erase 3 years of neglect? His hand hovered in the air for 3 long seconds. Then he knocked. 3 times. Firm. Final. Footsteps inside. A pause. The peephole darkened as she looked through. He heard her breath catch even through the door. The locks clicked. 1, 2, 3. She opened the door 6 inches, the chain still engaged, and stared at him with eyes that held shock and something that looked dangerously close to concern. Zito? She was wearing sweatpants and an oversized sweater, her hair loose and damp like she'd just showered. No makeup, no armor. Just Melissa, raw and real, and so beautiful it hurt to look at her. What are you doing here? What happened to you? I left them. The words came out hoarse, ragged. The council, the elders. I walked away. The Russo marriage, the empire, the title, all of it. I gave it back. He pushed his wet hair out of his eyes, and his hands were shaking. When had his hands started shaking? I'm unemployed, Melissa. I'm just a man. No territory, no accounts, no power, just me. He stepped closer to the door, his voice dropping to something desperate. Is that enough? Melissa's face went through a dozen emotions in 2 seconds. Shock, disbelief, something that might have been hope. Then her expression hardened into something that broke him completely. Pity. She didn't remove the chain. She stepped back instead, putting more distance between them despite the door. You didn't do that for me, Zito. Yes, I did. I did it all for... You did it to clear your guilty conscience. Her voice was quiet but firm, each word a nail in his coffin. You did it because you couldn't stand the weight of your own choices. You did it because you needed to be the hero in your own story. But I'm not a prize you win by making a dramatic sacrifice. I'm not a problem you solve by throwing away your crown. Zito felt the ground shift beneath him. I thought this was what you wanted. You said you wanted a normal man. A man who comes home at 5. I can be that now. Can you? Melissa's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. You've been a king for 10 years, Zito. You've had armies at your back and fortunes at your fingertips. You've never been powerless a day in your life. What happens in 6 months when the silence of a normal life starts eating at you? When you wake up and realize you traded an empire for a woman who can't give you back the rush of power? She wrapped her arms around herself, the oversized sweater making her look smaller, younger, more vulnerable. I won't be the reason you resent your life. I won't be the anchor that drowned your ambitions. You're not. Figure out who you are without the ring first. She cut him off, her jaw tight. Figure out what Zito Monaldo looks like when he's not commanding rooms or making men tremble. Figure out if you even like that version of yourself. Then come find me. Her voice cracked on the last word. If I'm still here. She started to close the door. Zito's hand shot out, stopping it. Not forceful, pleading. Melissa, please, just let me. Good night, Zito. She looked at him one last time, and the pain in her eyes was a physical thing, sharp and visceral. Then she gently pushed his hand away and closed the door. The locks clicked back into place. 1, 2, 3. Final as coffin nails. Zito stood in the hallway staring at the dried red wreath, listening to her footsteps retreat into the apartment. He heard a soft sound that might have been a sob. Then silence. He pressed his forehead against her door, his hands flat against the wood, water dripping from his clothes onto the worn carpet. He wanted to knock again, wanted to shout through the door that he loved her, that he'd always loved her, that giving up the empire was the easiest decision he'd ever made because she was worth more than all of it combined. But he didn't, because she was right. He didn't know who he was without the power. He'd been Zito Monaldo, king of a criminal empire, since he was 23 years old. Before that, he'd been Zito Monaldo, heir and son. He'd never been just Zito, just a man, and she deserved more than a man still learning how to exist without a crown. He walked down the 3 flights of stairs, his legs heavy, his chest hollow. The rain had stopped. The streets were slick and black, reflecting the streetlights in wavering pools. He sat down on the bottom step of her building, his expensive ruined suit soaking up water from the concrete. Somewhere above him, behind a window with red curtains, the woman he loved was crying. And he couldn't fix it, couldn't command it, couldn't make it right with money or power or grand gestures. He had to earn her. And he had no idea how. Zito found Charlie Morrison 3 days later in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and old grease. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone hun. Charlie sat in a corner booth, grading papers with a red pen, a half-eaten turkey sandwich forgotten on his plate. He looked up when Zito's shadow fell across the table, and the color drained from his face so fast, Zito thought the man might pass out. Mr. Monaldo. Charlie's voice came out strangled. His hand moved instinctively toward his phone. I haven't seen Melissa since that night at the lounge. I swear, I didn't. Relax. Zito gestured to the empty seat across from him. Can I sit? He didn't wait for permission. He slid into the booth, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. It wasn't easy when you'd spent 10 years perfecting the art of intimidation. Charlie stared at him like a rabbit watching a wolf, his hand still hovering near his phone. I'm not here to hurt you. Then why are you here? Charlie's voice shook, but there was a thread of courage underneath. The man was terrified but sitting his ground. Zito had to respect that. Zito folded his hands on the table, his eyes dropping to the cheap laminate surface. This was harder than walking away from the council, harder than giving up his empire. This was humility, raw and unfamiliar, tasting like copper on his tongue. I need to know how you do it. The words came out rough, scraped from somewhere deep. How do you make her smile like that? I gave her diamonds, and she gave me resignation letters. You give her coffee, and she glows. Charlie blinked. Once, twice. Then his fear began to melt into something else. Recognition. Understanding. You're serious. Do I look like I'm joking? Zito met his eyes, and whatever Charlie saw there made him lean back in the booth, his shoulders relaxing fractionally. The teacher studied him for a long moment, taking in the wrinkled shirt, the dark circles under his eyes, the way Zito's hands trembled slightly against the table. Charlie set down his red pen with a soft click. You really love her. It wasn't a question. Charlie said it like a diagnosis, clinical and final. More than my next breath. Zito's voice was barely above a whisper. But I don't know how to show her. I don't know how to be what she needs. The waitress appeared with a pot of coffee. Refill, hun? Charlie nodded. She poured 2 cups without asking if Zito wanted one, then disappeared. Charlie wrapped his hands around the chipped mug, steam rising between them like a barrier. You want to know the secret? He took a sip, considering his words. I listen to her, Mr. Monaldo. You look at her. You admire her like a painting in a museum. Something beautiful but untouchable. But I listen to what she's afraid of, what she dreams about when she thinks no one cares enough to ask. The words hit Zito like a physical blow. He thought about all those late nights in the office. Melissa organizing his chaos while he barked orders. He thought about the way he'd watched her move through his world with military precision, admiring her efficiency, her control, her unshakable composure. He'd never asked what she dreamed about. He'd never asked what scared her. He'd never asked anything that wasn't related to contracts or schedules or damage control. She wants an art gallery. Charlie's voice pulled him back. Did you know that? She studied art history in college before she needed to pay off student loans, and took the first high-paying job she could find, which happened to be working for you. He smiled sadly. She mentioned it once when we were having coffee, said she used to spend Saturdays wandering through galleries, imagining what it would be like to curate a space where people could see beauty in the chaos. She said it like it was a silly dream, like she'd given up on it years ago. Zito's chest constricted. He remembered that conversation, 2 years ago, 2 in the morning. They were reviewing contracts for a shipping merger, and she'd been exhausted, rubbing her temples. He'd asked if she wanted more coffee. She'd said no. She wanted to be in a gallery somewhere, standing in front of something beautiful that had nothing to do with territorial disputes or profit margins. He'd laughed. He'd actually laughed and told her beauty didn't pay the bills. Then he'd handed her another contract to review. I remember. The admission tasted like ash. She told me. I heard her, but I didn't value it. Charlie nodded slowly. Looking and listening are different things, Mr. Monaldo. You saw her. Every day for 3 years you saw her. But you never listened to who she actually was beneath the blazer and the bun and the efficiency. He pushed his plate away, the sandwich still half-eaten. She doesn't want diamonds. She wants someone who remembers the small things, who acts on the dreams she whispers at 2 in the morning when she's too tired to guard her heart. Zito stood abruptly. His mind was already racing, puzzle pieces clicking together, a plan forming from the wreckage of his old life. Charlie looked up, startled. Are you? Thank you. Zito extended his hand across the table. Charlie stared at it for a moment, then took it. The handshake was firm, respectful, an acknowledgement between 2 men who loved the same woman for entirely different reasons. I mean it. Thank you, Charlie. He walked out of the diner into the gray afternoon, the bell above the door chiming his exit. He had a plan now. It would take time. It would take work. It would require him to be someone he'd never been before, a man who built something with his hands instead of his threats. But for Melissa, for the woman who dreamed of beauty in a world of chaos, he would learn. Today was supposed to be her last day. Melissa sat at her kitchen table, staring at the calendar marked with red X's, counting down to freedom, and all she felt was dread. Zito had been gone for 10 days. No calls, no texts, no shadow darkening her doorway at midnight, just silence. The kind of silence that screamed something was wrong. She'd checked the news obsessively. No reports of bodies found. No mafia wars erupting in the streets, no headlines screaming about fallen kings, but the absence of news felt worse than confirmation. She knew what the elders were capable of. She knew what happened to men who walked away. They didn't just lose their empire, they lost their lives. And Zito had publicly humiliated them, thrown his ring on their table like garbage, chosen dishonor over duty. Men had died for less. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Her heart lurched. She opened the message with shaking hands. Just an address. Nothing else. No explanation. No name. Just a street downtown in a neighborhood she'd never been to. It could be a trap. It could be the elders using her to finish what they started. It could be nothing. But her hands were already grabbing her keys. Her feet were already moving toward the door. The address led her to a narrow street lined with abandoned storefronts and graffitied walls. Buildings that had seen better decades. She almost turned back twice. Then she saw it. A single-story building with brown paper taped over the windows, paint peeling off the door. But something about it looked different from the decay around it. Newer. Like someone had been working on it recently. Melissa pushed open the door. It swung on new hinges, silent and smooth. The scent hit her first. Fresh paint and sawdust and something underneath that made her chest tighten. Old books, canvas, the ghost of what this place could become. She stepped inside and froze. Zito stood in the center of the empty room with a broom in his hands. He wore jeans, actual jeans, faded and torn at the knee. A plain white t-shirt covered in drywall dust and paint splatters. His hair was longer than she remembered, falling into his eyes. His hands, those hands that used to sign death warrants and broker million-dollar deals, were covered in calluses and cuts. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face was something she'd never seen before. Vulnerable, exhausted, hopeful in a way that broke her heart. You came. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been breathing dust for days. He set the broom against the wall carefully, his movements slow. I wasn't sure you would. Melissa couldn't speak. She turned in a slow circle, taking it in. The walls were half-scraped and primed white. The floors were stripped but unfinished, smelling of raw effort. Track lighting hung from the ceiling, new and professional. The back wall had built-in shelving, perfect for displaying art. The space was raw and unfinished but full of potential, full of possibility. full of her dream that she'd whispered once at 2 a.m. and never mentioned again. "What is this?" Her voice came out strangled. Zito reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They jangled softly in the silence. "It's yours. The building. I used what was left in my private account. It's not much. The neighborhood isn't great, but it has good bones. Natural light from the skylights I installed. Enough space for 30 pieces. Maybe 40 if you're creative." He took 3 steps toward her, then stopped, maintaining distance like she was something wild that might bolt. "I'm not asking you to love me, Melissa." She looked at him then. Really looked. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. His shoulders were tense with uncertainty. This wasn't the king who'd commanded her for 3 years. This wasn't even the broken man who'd shown up at her door soaked and desperate. This was someone new. Someone she'd never met but somehow recognized. "I'm asking you to take this." He held out the keys, his hand steady despite everything. "You gave me 3 years of your life. I wasted them. I took your loyalty and your brilliance and your patience, and I gave you nothing but demands and late nights and a resignation letter you had to write because I was too blind to see what I was doing to you." His voice cracked on the last word. "This is my repayment. Open your gallery. Show the world the beauty you see. Be happy. I'll go." The keys hung between them, catching the light from the new fixtures. Melissa felt something inside her chest crack open. Something she'd been holding tight for 3 years finally breaking free. She crossed the distance and took the keys from his hand. Their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, brief, devastating. His skin was rough now, marked by labor she never thought he'd do. "Thank you." The words were barely a whisper. She wanted to say more. She wanted to tell him this was the most terrifying, beautiful thing anyone had ever done for her, that she'd been wrong about him, that maybe people could change. But fear locked the words in her throat. Fear that this was temporary. Fear that he'd wake up one day and resent her for the crown he'd thrown away. Fear that she'd given him her heart, and he'd realized too late he didn't actually want it. Zito nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin. He didn't move toward her, didn't ask for a kiss or a promise or anything that would ease the raw agony written across his face. He just walked past her toward the door, his shoulder brushing hers for half a second. The scent of paint and sawdust and him filled her lungs. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving her alone in the gallery he'd built with his hands. The keys felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Or maybe that was her heart. 6 months passed like a held breath. Melissa's gallery opened to quiet acclaim, small at first, a handful of local artists, a review in an arts magazine that called her space intimate and revelatory. Then word spread, the kind of word that can't be bought or forced. People came because the art spoke to them, because Melissa had an eye for beauty that cut through pretense and found the raw human truth underneath. She was good at this. Better than she'd ever been at organizing chaos for a man who never noticed her. Zito took a consulting job, corporate restructuring for legitimate businesses. The kind of work that involved spreadsheets and conference calls, and absolutely no blood. It paid well enough. It bored him senseless, but he showed up every day at 9 and left at 5, just like she'd said she wanted. He lived in a small apartment in Queens. He rode the subway. He learned how to be nobody. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. They didn't speak. Not once in 6 months. But Melissa thought about him every time she unlocked the gallery doors. Every time she hung a new piece on the walls he'd sanded. Every time someone told her the space had good bones. And Zito thought about her every morning when he didn't call. Every night when he didn't show up at her door. Every moment of every day when he reminded himself that loving someone meant giving them space to breathe. Charlie never stopped coming around. Kind, patient, safe Charlie. He showed up with coffee on opening night. He helped hang pieces when her assistant called in sick. He made her laugh when the stress of running a business threatened to drown her. And when he got down on one knee in the gallery after hours, a simple diamond ring in his hand, Melissa said yes. Because saying no would mean admitting she was still waiting for a man who'd learned to stay away. Because saying no would mean acknowledging that safety felt like drowning and she missed the storm. The invitation was cream cardstock with elegant script. Simple, classic. The kind of wedding invitation that spoke of sensible choices and careful planning. Melissa addressed one by hand, her pen hovering over the name for 3 long minutes before she finally wrote it. Zito Monaldo. No title, no flourish, just his name and an address in Queens she'd gotten from a mutual contact who owed her a favor. She needed to see him one last time to prove to herself that seeing him wouldn't break her. She needed to look him in the eye and feel nothing. The church was small and cold despite the summer heat outside. White roses and baby's breath lined the aisle. Organ music played softly. Charlie stood at the altar in a navy suit, his face open and hopeful and kind. Everything a groom should be. Melissa waited in the back room, her hands shaking as she adjusted her simple white dress. Not a ball gown, not a statement, just a dress that said she was ready to be someone's wife. She walked down the aisle alone. No father to give her away. Just her and the weight of a choice that felt heavier with each step. The guests smiled. Charlie's eyes got wet. And in the back row, sitting perfectly still in a gray suit that looked nothing like the black armor he used to wear, was Zito. He'd come. Part of her hadn't believed he would. Part of her had hoped he wouldn't. But there he sat, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on some point above the altar. Not on her. Never on her. Like looking directly at her would break what little control he had left. His hair was shorter now, professional. His jaw was clean-shaven. He looked like someone who paid taxes and followed traffic laws and had never signed a death warrant in his life. Melissa reached the altar. Charlie took her hands. They were warm and soft and steady. The priest began the ceremony. Words about love and commitment and choosing each other every day. Words she'd heard at a dozen other weddings. Words that should have meant something but sounded like white noise. She was supposed to be looking at Charlie, supposed to be seeing her future in his kind eyes. Instead, she kept feeling the pull of the man in the back row who'd given her everything and asked for nothing. The priest reached the critical moment. If anyone here has reason these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence stretched. Melissa's heart hammered so hard she thought the whole church could hear it. She waited for Zito to stand up, to object, to storm down the aisle and demand she choose him. But he didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there with his head slightly bowed like a man at his own funeral. The priest continued, "Do you, Charles Morrison, take this woman?" Melissa wasn't listening anymore. Something was breaking inside her chest, something that had been cracked for 6 months finally shattering completely. She turned, not toward Charlie, not toward the priest, toward the back of the church where a man in a gray suit sat perfectly still. Zito looked up. Their eyes met across 30 feet of cold church air, and in his eyes, she saw everything he wasn't saying. "I love you. I'll always love you. But I won't destroy your chance at happiness. Choose him, if that's what you need. I'll survive it." Somehow, the silence stretched too long. Charlie's hands tightened on hers. "Melissa?" His voice was quiet, confused. The guests began to murmur. The priest cleared his throat, but Melissa couldn't look away from the man in the back row, couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the devastating truth settling in her bones like an earthquake. She'd made a terrible mistake. Charlie's hands went still around hers. He looked at her face, then followed her gaze to the back of the church where Zito sat frozen like a man watching his execution. Charlie's expression did something complicated, pain and understanding, and a resigned kind of sadness that made him look older than his 32 years. He squeezed her hands once, gently, then let go. "You haven't looked at me once since you walked down the aisle." His voice was barely a whisper, meant only for her. The guests leaned forward, straining to hear. The priest stood paralyzed, his book of vows forgotten. "You've been looking at the exit." "He's at the exit." Melissa's throat closed. "Charlie, I'm so sorry. I thought I could." "I know." He touched her cheek with heartbreaking tenderness. "I know what you thought. But I can't marry a woman who's still in love with someone else. I won't be the man you settle for because he scares you." He stepped back, his navy suit suddenly looking too formal, too final. "Go, Melissa, before I change my mind and ask you to stay anyway." She didn't think. Thinking would have trapped her in logic and fear, and all the reasons this was wrong. She just moved. Her white dress rustled as she turned away from the altar, away from safety, away from the life she'd tried to convince herself she wanted. Her heels clicked against the stone floor, each step echoing like a countdown. The guests gasped. Someone's mother made a small, shocked sound. Melissa didn't care. She walked faster. Then she ran. Zito stood up as she approached, his face a mask of shock and something that looked dangerously close to hope. She didn't stop. She grabbed his hand, lacing her fingers through his, feeling the calluses from 6 months of honest labor. "Come with me." Her voice was raw, desperate. "Please." He didn't ask questions. He just let her pull him down the aisle, past the stunned guests, past Charlie, who stood at the altar with his hands in his pockets, looking smaller and sadder than she'd ever seen him. They burst through the church doors into blinding summer sunlight. Melissa kept running, kept pulling him, her dress gathering at her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They didn't kiss on the church steps, didn't stop to explain or apologize or make sense of what just happened. They just ran until they reached the corner. Zito hailed a taxi, just as he did the night he left the council. He didn't have a car. He didn't need one. "Where are we going?" His voice was rough with disbelief and longing. "The Sapphire Lounge." Melissa looked at him, really looked at him. "Where it started, where I lost you, where I need to find you again." The lounge was quiet on a Saturday afternoon. The lunch crowd had left. The dinner crowd hadn't arrived yet. Just soft jazz playing to an empty room and a bartender who recognized Zito and wisely disappeared into the back. They sat at the same table by the floor-to-ceiling glass where Melissa had sat with Charlie 6 months ago, where Zito had watched her laugh and realized too late what he was losing. The river glittered beyond the windows, catching the late afternoon sun in 1,000 golden fragments. Zito looked at her across the small table. She was still in her wedding dress, her hair coming loose from its careful updo, her makeup smudged from running. She'd never looked more beautiful. "Do you miss the safety?" The question hurt to ask, but he needed to know. "Charlie could have given you everything you said you wanted. Sundays off, 5 o'clock dinners, a life without looking over your shoulder." Melissa reached across the table and touched his face. Her palm rested against his jaw, feeling the tension there, the barely controlled hope. "I never wanted safety, Zito. I wanted to be seen." Charlie looked at me and saw a good wife, a safe choice, someone who wouldn't complicate his life. "But you? You see me, the real me, the woman who dreams in color and wants beauty even when the world is ugly. The woman who isn't afraid of intensity, who just needed to know you wouldn't burn me up and leave nothing but ash." Zito's hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm harder against his skin like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. "I built a life without the crown. I learned how to be just a man, not a king, not a boss, just Zito. Is that enough?" "It's everything." She leaned forward, closing the distance between them. "You were always enough. I was just too scared to believe you'd choose me over the Empire. But you did. You chose me before I even chose myself." He kissed her then, slow and deep and desperate, like a man drowning finally breaking the surface. 6 months of restraint shattered in that kiss. 6 months of missing her and wanting her and respecting her boundary dissolved into heat and hunger and home. His hand tangled in her hair, pulling pins loose until chestnut waves fell free. Her fingers gripped his shoulders, the gray fabric bunching under her touch. They broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, and the world narrowed to just them and the sound of their ragged breath and the jazz playing softly in the background. They sat back slowly, hands still clasped across the table. He was not a Don. She was not a secretary. They were just two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of who they used to be. Zito's phone rang. The sound shattered the moment like glass breaking. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his expression went carefully neutral. "It's Salvatore. The council." Melissa's chest tightened. "Are you going to answer?" He looked at the phone. Then he looked at her. Really looked at her, like he was memorizing every detail. The red dress she wasn't wearing, but he'd never forget. The way her eyes caught the light. The small smile playing at her lips that said she trusted him to make the right choice. Zito picked up his glass of water, the ice already melting. Then he dropped the phone in. It sank slowly, bubbles rising as the circuits died. The ringing stopped. The silence was perfect. "They can find another king," Zito said quietly. "I already found my kingdom." Melissa smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and lit up the entire room. She stood, still holding his hand, and pulled him to his feet. "Take me home, Zito. Our home. Wherever that is." He kissed her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "Anywhere you are. If you believe that true love is worth burning down an empire for, like this video, and subscribe for more stories where the heart wins over power.